When Elias Warren returned to his old ranch in the Colorado mountains, he thought he was coming home to silence, maybe to the ghosts he'd left behind. What he found instead was something that rattled him to his core. 3 of his Mustangs, once wild emblems of strength and freedom, now standing broken on his porch. Their flanks were scarred, their eyes hollow, their bodies trembling as if they'd been dragged from a nightmare. What had happened in his absence? And why did every wound on their bodies whisper betrayal, leading back to the very people he once called family? Elias didn't know it yet, but this was no simple homecoming. It was the first step into a storm of deception, cruelty, and blood-soaked secrets that Durango had buried for too long. By the time he reached the outskirts of town, autumn night had already closed its fist around the valley. The wind came rushing down from the San Juans, sharp and cold, carrying with it the resin bite of pine and the dampness of unsettled earth. Overhead, the moon glared like a tarnished coin, spilling silver across the ridges and skeletal pastures. Durango was a hushed silhouette, its few street lamps glowing weak against the vast dark. Shuttered storefronts lined the deserted main street. A single neon sign over the diner buzzed defiantly, bleeding pink onto wet pavement, but no one sat inside. Cottonwoods shivered at the edge of town, their bare branches clattering like brittle bones. As Elias rolled through in his battered F-250, the suspension rattling over scarred asphalt, he felt the silence pressing harder. Not the peace of rest, but the kind that stalked you, waiting to break with violence. He cracked the window. Smoke from distant chimneys drifted on the wind, laced with pine needles and wet soil. It was a smell he knew from 100 nights in another life. The mountains hadn't changed, but everything else had. 40 years behind him, scars of war carved into his body and soul, Elias guided the truck down the dirt road toward the ranch. The tires crunched over gravel he could have driven blind. Home was supposed to be here, waiting, constant. But as he turned onto his property and the porch came into view, what waited for him wasn't comfort. It was the broken horses. And behind them, just for a moment, he swore he saw another shadow move. Not animal, human, watching. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. Time had been counted in deployments, in months of dust and heat beneath foreign suns, not in birthdays. His body carried it, those shoulders broadened and kept taut by years of drills. Forearms hardened from work skin, darkened and creased from wind. There were threads of gray at his temples now, more than he liked to admit, and a line cut deep between his brows that no sleep ever seemed to erase. He was not a man who smiled easily. He never had been. But there had been a time when his silences were patient ones, full of the easy calm of a rider with his horse. Somewhere along the way, that calm had been stripped down, leaving something sterner behind. Still, there was patience in him, and loyalty, the kind forged in the saddle and on the line. Horses had taught him, as much as the cores ever did, keep steady hands. Trust what's beneath you. Never waste your strength until the moment calls. That part of him had not changed, even if almost everything else had. The truck hit another rut and jolted. Elias gripped the wheel tighter, eyes narrowing on the road. The ranch lay a few miles further out, past the split where the cottonwoods gave way to open fields. He hadn't seen it in years, not since the divorce papers were signed. Claire had stayed. He had gone. She had been the one to keep the ranch, at least on paper, though he still thought of it as his in some deeper way, as though the land itself hadn't chosen sides. He had told no one he was coming back. The plan was simple. Drive up, see the house, maybe knock on the door. If she answered, he'd find the words as they came. If not, well, then at least he would have seen it again. The place where everything had started. The road narrowed, fenced on either side by rails gone gray with weather. Weeds pushed up through the gravel, catching the headlights and pale stalks. Elias remembered riding here in the mornings, Storm's black man whipping in the wind, the sound of hooves steady against the earth. He remembered Arrow's youthful sprint, outrunning the others, just for the joy of it, and Stone's solid weight behind them, steady as a wall. The memory rose unbidden, vivid against the darkness. It tightened something inside him he'd thought long since dead. And, of course, he remembered Claire, the way she used to stand on the porch in the evening's auburn hair catching the last fire of the sunset waiting for him to come in from the pastures. That image had stayed with him even through desert sandstorms and nights under alien stars. He wasn't fool enough to think he could bring it back. Some things were finished, but part of him, stubborn as ever, needed to see for himself what was left. If I can't go home, he thought, at least I can look at the bones of it. He turned the final bend tires, and then crunching over the familiar lane. The ranch house came into view, the gabled roof, the porch slanting slightly with age, the light above the steps burning a tired yellow. For an instant, in the wash of the headlights, it looked unchanged. The same flower pots still hung by the railing, though they were filled now only with brittle stems. The grass was cut, the paint on the siding, weathered but intact. From a distance, it could have been the same home he'd left behind. Then the light shifted and he saw them. 3 figures stood huddled together on the porch shapes, sharp against the glow. For a moment, he thought his eyes deceived him. Perhaps shadows, perhaps deer come too close to town. But as the truck rolled to a stop, the beams cut across them and his heart slammed once against his ribs. They were horses, not just horses. His horses. Storm was in the middle, as he always had been. The stallion's black coat looked ragged in the lamplight, patches matted where once they shone. His ears flicked alert, even in exhaustion, and his amber eyes fixed on Elias, with a dim spark that hadn't yet gone out. Across his flank ran a welt, fresh and angry, the kind left by a lash, or boot. Around his neck, hanging low on a frayed strip of leather, was something Elias recognized instantly, a crude knot of rawhide he had braided years ago, a token he'd fastened to Storm's halter the week before deployment. To Storm's left stood Arrow. The bay gelding was thinner than Elias remembered ribs, faint under the hide-eyes, heaving with each breath. His head jerked nervously at every sound. The creak of the truck's engine, the whine of the wind, like a creature taught to expect blows from every direction. The fire that had once made him the fastest in the pasture now looked dimmed, replaced with a weary edge. Stone was on the right, bigger, older, but the roan had always been the anchor of the trio. Now his massive shoulders sagged and his breath steamed unevenly in the cold. His coat was dulled by neglect, and deep around his throat ran grooves, the unmistakable marks of long-worn restraints. He leaned slightly toward Storm, as if the younger horse's presence alone held him upright. All 3 were gaunt, unkempt, their mans tangled with burrs. They looked like creatures driven out, left to fend for themselves in the cold shadows of the mustangs they had been. And yet, Elias knew them in an instant. The world tilted. Mustangs were freedom, incarnate, the wild spirit of the West given flesh. To see them like this, his mustangs once, proud and indomitable, reduced to trembling on the porch like beggars, was an obscenity. It struck him harder than any firefight had. For a long heartbeat, he could not move. Staring through the windshield, breath caught somewhere between disbelief and fury. At last, he killed the engine and stepped out into the cold. Gravel crunched beneath his boots. The horses lifted their heads, ears flicking forward. Storm shifted first, sniffing the air. Elias raised a hand slowly, voice low and roughened from disuse. "Storm," he whispered. The stallion's ears twitched. A tremor ran down his body. He stepped forward, hooves clattering softly on the porch boards. Arrow lifted his head from Storm's shoulder, eyes wide, and Stone rumbled a low sound, almost a groan. When Storm reached Elias, the horse hesitated for only a moment. Then, with a shuddering breath, he pressed his muzzle into Elias's chest. The contact sent a rush of memory through him. The countless mornings in the pasture, the trust built from long miles together, something hard inside. Elias broke then, and his hand came up, fingers curling into the coarse mane. Beneath Storm's jaw, something knocked against his palm. He drew it out and stared, the raw hide. Not still there, still worn smooth by years of weather and time. He had made it the week before he left, sitting on the porch with a knife and scraped leather, carving it into the rough shape of a shield. He told Storm it was a badge for the team, a promise he would come back. Storm had carried it all this time. Behind him, Arrow whickered softly and stepped closer, pressing his muzzle to Elias's arm. Stone moved with a heavy shuffle, nudging at his shoulder. One by one, they came to him as if some wall between them had finally crumbled. Elias's throat tightened. He stood there with them, clustered around 3 bodies, radiating heat into the chill night, and felt something steady rise within him. He remembered Storm leaping the creek at full gallop arrows, triumphant whinny echoing at dusk Stone shouldering, through a storm to shield the others. He remembered every ounce of strength they had once carried, and saw now how far they had been dragged from it. Who did this? The thought burned hot, sharper. Then the cold wind. Who let them fall to this? The anger came hard, but he held it tight, banked it deep. There would be time for it later. For now, there was only this. His horses had found him again, and he would not abandon them a second time. He laid a hand on Storm's neck, felt the tremor in the muscles beneath, and bent his head close. "You still remember," he said softly, "and I swear to you, I won't leave you again." The stallion huffed warm breath, clouding the air. For the first time in years, Elias let the words settle in his own chest like a vow renewed. Whatever had been taken, whatever had been broken, began here with the three of them huddled in the porch light, and this time he would not let it be lost. The drive to the cabin was slow and tense. Elias had backed the old Ford up close to the porch, its taillights glowing faint red against the dark. One by one, he clipped leads to the halters of Storm, Arrow, and Stone, murmuring low as he worked. Storm moved first, as he always did, the big stallion stepping down with the kind of authority that still clung to him, even through exhaustion. Yet his stride faltered, a faint hitch in the right hind leg that made Elias's jaw tighten. Arrow followed in a jitter of nerves, ears swiveling, eyes wide. Every flash of the headlights, every hiss of wind through the pines sent him flinching sideways. Stone was last, massive hooves thutooing on the gravel, as though each step carried twice the weight it should. Twice he slowed to a standstill, head drooping, until Storm nudged him forward with a flick of his ears. The road away. From the ranch, Dalton lay black as pitch. The only illumination came from the truck's beams stretching across the dirt track, and the intermittent glimmer of moonlight through the clouds. There, hooves struck a hollow rhythm, echoing strangely in the night, a sound both steady and fragile. Elias drove with one hand on the wheel, the other occasionally tightening on Storm's lead through the window, reassuring himself that the stallion remained beside him. When the cabin finally appeared, its corrugated tin roof glistening with dew and its plank walls gray with age, Elias felt a ripple of relief. It was a humble place, rented 2 days earlier through a local contact, but it would serve. It stood just beyond the treeing, a stone's throw from the dark expanse of Animus Lake, and to Elias it seemed tucked out of the world's reach. The single bulb above the porch flickered as he pulled up, casting a cone of pale light over the slick steps. He killed the engine, stepped down, and guided the Mustangs into the crude paddock he had hammered together the day before with scrap rails and borrowed nails. Inside the makeshift shelter, he worked quickly. He stripped a stack of coarse towels from a box and set about drying them one by one, starting with Storm. The stallion stood tense at first sides, quivering, but the pressure of Elias's hand and the steady drag of cloth began to ease the tremors. Storm's ears flicked forward, then back, then forward again, until at last he lowered his head and let out a slow breath. Arrow was harder. The begelding skittered sideways at the rasp of cloth eyes flashing white. Elias spoke in the same voice he had used years ago during drills, quiet, patient, insistent, and, at length, Arrow, stilled enough for him to run the towel down his back. Stone hardly moved at all. The ran only shifted his weight, and with a groan, leaning into Elias's arm as if grateful for the pressure. When they were dried as best as he could manage, Elias turned to food. He had bought supplies from the general store that afternoon. Bags of oat salt, blocks, a few sacks of hay stored in the shed. He filled 3 buckets, sprinkling a pinch of mineral salt over the top, and set them out. Arrow went for his first muzzle, plunging deep, chewing as though the feed might vanish any second. Yet even in hunger, he paused, jerking his head up every few seconds at the creak of wood or whisper of wind, nostrils flaring. Stone ate slower, grinding the grains with deliberate patience, resting now and then against the wall, as if the effort wore him. Storm stood off to the side until both had fed, watching, waiting, before finally lowering his own head to eat. The sight made Elias's throat knot. Leadership held, even in weakness. The sharp smell of oats soon thickened the air, pushing back the damp odor of old timber and mildew. For the first time, that night, the place felt less like a ruin and more like shelter. Later, with a flashlight clutched in his teeth and both hands free, Elias began the examination. He worked methodically the way he had been trained to check his mount before a patrol. The Storm first, along the stallion's flank, beneath the dull sheen of black hair. He found the swelling a bruise the size of his palm purpled and hot. A shallow scrape cut across it, raw enough to make Storm flinch when Elias pressed. Gently. That kind of injury did not come from accident. It came from impact, from something swung. Hard. A boot, a rod, a whip. Elias muttered a curse under his breath, and smoothed his hand along the neck, steadying the horse until Storm's breathing eased. Arrow bore no obvious wounds, but his behavior told another story. When Elias lifted a hand too quickly, the geling snapped back as though expecting pain. His eyes rolled white and his muscles tensed under the skin. This was no ordinary skittishness. He was learned, fear drilled into him by repetition. Elias lowered his hand, waited until the horse's breathing, slowed, then stroked gently from jaw to withers. "Easy," he whispered. "No one's hurting you here." Stone's injuries were plainer. Around the Rand's thick neck ran furrows dark and ridged, where rope had bitten deep over weeks or months. The flesh beneath was tender, the skin calloused in ugly seams. When Elias brushed his fingers there, Stone let out a low rumble knees, dipping slightly before he caught himself. Elias clenched his teeth and steadied him, pressing his forehead briefly to the horse's shoulder. "All right, boy, it's all right now." His voice rasped, anger buried beneath it. "You're safe." By the time he finished, his knuckles were stiff from clenching the flashlight, and his chest burned with a slow, seething fire. Whoever had done this had not merely neglected them. They had broken trust. They had tried to grind the spirit out of creatures built for freedom. It was near midnight when the sound of tires, crunching gravel reached him. Elias straightened from the rail, every sense sharp. A moment later, an old pickup rolled to a stop near the gate. Its headlights snapped off, and from the cab climbed a stout woman with silver hair tied back under a scarf, a heavy flashlight in her hand. She walked with the easy assurance of someone who had spent her life on ranch soil. "Evening," she called, her voice carrying over the paddock. "Saw your truck lights. Thought I'd make sure you weren't lost." Elias recognized her, then Ruth called. Her, who owned a modest spread near the lake. She was well into her 60 seconds, but her eyes were keen and quick. "I'm settled," Elias answered, stepping to the fence. "Appreciate you checking." Ruth's gaze shifted past him to the 3 horses. Her expression tightened. "Lord above," she murmured. "Storm arrow Stone. I didn't expect to see them again. Not like this." The beam of her flashlight lingered on the marks along Storm's flank, the hollows in Arrow's ribs, the grooves around Stone's neck. She shook her head slowly. "They've been through hell." Elias's jaw worked, but he said nothing. Ruth lowered the light lips, pressed thin. "There's been talk. People in and out of Dalton Place at odd hours. Men I don't recognize. Not the sort you'd call horsemen. Something's gone crooked there, Mr. Warren. You do well to keep watch." Her words settled like stones in Elias's stomach. He nodded once. "Thank you. I'll take it. From here." Ruth studied him another moment, then gave a small nod of her own. She dropped a bundle of hay from the truck bed by the gate. "Take this. Won't last long, but it's clean. They need it." "Grateful," Elias said. She turned back to her pickup. As she climbed in the flashlight, beam swung across her face, and for a heartbeat, her eyes met his. There was warning there and a trace of sympathy. Then the engine coughed to life and she was gone. Taillights dwindling into the dark. The cabin grew quiet again. Wind hissed through the pine tops, rattling the tin roof. From the paddock came the low sounds of horses shifting, breathing the occasional scrape of hoof on dirt. Inside, the heater clicked faintly, doing its best against the mountain chill. Elias lay on the narrow bed boot, still, staring up at the rafters. He could not close his eyes without seeing the images burn there. Storm's bruised arrows startled Flintstone's scarred neck. He could not forget Ruth's words, either the edge in her voice when she spoke of men, not the sort you'd call horsemen. Mason, Claire, he had suspected before. Now, suspicion was hardening into certainty. Fury simmered under his ribs, a heat that would have driven him from the bed if not for the weight of exhaustion, pinning him. But beneath the anger was something steadier. He thought of the way Storm had pressed his head into his chest on the porch. He thought of Arrow's hesitant trust stone, silent endurance. They had found him again after years apart. They had endured, and they were here. He turned on his side, eyes on the shadowed window. The wind moaned, branches scraping against glass. From outside came a soft wicker low and familiar, as though Storm were keeping watch even through the dark. Elias let out a long breath. "I'll find out," he whispered to the empty room. "I'll find out what they did to Kennedy. You. And I swear no one will touch you again." Sleep never fully came. The night stretched long, broken only by the sound of wind and the rhythm of 3 steady breaths outside his door. The morning broke pale and hesitant, as though the sun itself doubted it, had the strength to rise above the San Juans. Mist rolled off Animus Lake in thin veils, turning the shoreline into something half-dreamed. Elias stepped out of the cabin jacket collar, pulled up against the bite of autumn air, and breathed deep. The scent was sharper than the night before. Cold pine and wet stone laced with the faint sweetness of wood smoke from a ranch across the valley. Behind him, the horses stirred. Storm lifted his head-first ears, pricking at Elias's movement. Arrow followed quick-eyed and restless, tail flicking at every phantom sound. Stone slower took his time pushing himself upright with a grunt before shaking the dew from his coat. "Let's stretch those legs," Elias murmured. He clipped the leads and set off down the narrow trail that traced the lake's soak edge. The earth was damp beneath their hooves, crunching softly where frost still lingered in the shadows. Sunlight spilled weakly through thinning clouds, catching the mist in bands of gold. Arrow jerked once at the sudden flap of a bird's wings from the reed's eyes, flashing white until Storm swung an ear back in silent rebuke. Stone walked with the unhurried certainty of a draft engine, steady, deliberate, though twice he stumbled on uneven ground. Elias matched his stride to theirs, listening, watching. The rhythm of their breathing steadied him. For the first time since returning to Durango, he allowed himself to imagine this might work, that the cabin could serve, that he could rebuild strength into their frames, trust into their eyes. Then Storm stiffened. The stallion halted mid-stride, neck arched, nostrils flaring. The lead rope snapped taut, tugging hard, against Elias's grip. His ears locked forward, every muscle strung tight as a bowstring. "What is it?" Elias asked softly, scanning the tree-in. Storm didn't move, didn't blink. His gaze was fixed across the lake toward the rise of land where Dalton Ranch lay hidden behind its pines. A tremor ran down his flank, not of fear, but a focus of something remembered and despised. Elias followed the line of that gaze, his stomach tightening. He knew then they weren't just stretching their legs. Storm was leading him somewhere. The path bent away from the water, slipping into a copse of thin pines that rose behind Dalton land. Storm surged ahead, forcing Elias to lengthen his stride. Arrow trailed close, uneasy, while Stone lumbered behind each breath, a white plume in the cold. They emerged into a clearing. Elias stopped short. The ground here was raw, stripped bare in patches where no grass dared grow. Wooden posts jutted from the dirt, crooked and splintered, some still bound with coils of rusted chain. Shards of metal lay scattered links, snapped rings bent from strain. The earth was trampled into hard pen, gouged deep with overlapping hoofprints that told of struggle and panic. Elias's chest went cold. He crouched fingers, brushing one of the chains. Rust flaked off, staining his skin dark red. It clung sticky like dried blood. He lifted a broken link into the light at the jagged edge, catching the sun, and turned it over in his hand. Behind him, Arrow blew hard sides heaving. His eyes rolled as he shifted, hooves churning at the dirt as though the memories buried here still clung to him. Stone lowered his head to sniff the ground, then jerked back, ears flattened, lips curling in a low rumble. Storm let out a sound Elias had only heard on battlefields, a deep rolling growl of a whinny hooves pounding once, twice into the earth. The clearing stank of old fear. This wasn't a pasture, it was a pit, a ring, a place of confinement and cruelty. Elias rose slowly, the broken chain still clenched in his fist. A leaden weight settled in his chest. He didn't need to be told what had happened here. The earth itself carried the story horses tied, restrained, lashed, until their strength buckled. Not all horses can take this. The voice startled him. He turned sharply. At the edge of the clearing stood a man, wiry and weathered, a cigarette dangling unlit between his fingers. His face was carved from years in the sunlines, deep as riverbeds, and his hat sat low, shadowing pale eyes that studied Elias with something between pity and weariness. "Hank Torres?" Elias said after a moment, recognizing him. He'd worked at Dalton Ranch years ago, a hand who had always kept to himself. "That's right," the man answered. The voice was rough gravel dragged across steel. He didn't like the cigarette, only twirled it absently between thumb and forefinger. "I used to tend horses here. Not anymore." Elias nodded once. "You know what was done?" Hank's gaze slid to Storm, then back to Elias. "More than I care to." He shifted his weight silent, stretching, until Elias thought he might walk away. Then the words began to come halting at first, and flowing like a sleigh gate. Opened. "Mason Hale, he's the one brought them here. Said he was training them. Said they needed breaking." Hank spat into the dirt, breaking the word. He'd tie them to those posts. Let them fight the chains until their mouths foamed. When they dropped from hunger, he'd call a discipline. Elias's grip on the chain tightened until his knuckles whitened. Hank's eyes flicked toward Storm. That one Storm you called him, Mason. Hated him worst. Said he was too proud. Wouldn't bend. I saw it myself. He went at him with a boot, kicked him in the ribs hard enough to drop him, laughed when the horse staggered. Arrow shifted restlessly, as though the words alone stirred old terror. Stone blew through his nose and stomped once heavy, the sound like a muted drum. What about the others? Elias forced the question through clenched teeth. Fed them little. Some days nothing but green. Water. Arrow there spooked at his own shadow before long. Stone got the rope, tied so long it carved rings in his hide. Mason called it teaching patience. Hank finally lifted the cigarette to his mouth, though still he didn't light it. His lips pressed around it like a man, biting back bile. I couldn't take it. I quit the day he booted Storm, walked out, and never looked back. Should have done more, I know, but I couldn't stomach it. Silence fell again, heavier than before. The only sound was the ragged breathing of the horses, the soft clink of the broken chain in Elias's grip. At last, Elias spoke. Thank you for telling me. Hank's gaze searched him, measuring. Then he gave a short nod and turned boots crunching over the dirt as he walked toward the trees. He didn't look back. Elias stood alone in the clearing, heart pounding against his ribs. The broken chain dug into his palm, the rust smearing his skin like blood. Everything lined up now. The bruise on Storm's flank, the flinches in Arrow's eyes, the scars around Stone's neck. They weren't accidents. They weren't neglect. They were deliberate, inflicted with purpose. Mason hadn't simply failed them. He had tried to crush them. Heat surged through Elias's chest, rising fast. He had felt fury in combat before when friends were cut down, when orders dragged him into pointless fire. But this was different. This was personal direct cutting into the marrow of his life. He swallowed it back through tamping it down beneath a layer of iron. Rage wouldn't serve here, not yet. Storm shifted beside him, ears flicked. Toward the ranch, hidden beyond the pines' eyes burning like embers. Elias stroked the stallion's neck, steadying him, though his own pulse raced. We'll make it right, he said, quietly. Words more vow than comfort. I won't let him touch you again. Storm snorted, stamping one's gaze, still fixed in the direction of Dalton Land. Elias led them away, back toward the lake. Yet, even as they left the clearing, Storm's head remained turned, ears locked forward, amber eyes bright with a fierce and unyielding fire. Elias felt it too searing hot beneath his ribs. The questions he'd carried were no longer questions. The suspicion was gone. Certainty had taken its place, and with certainty came resolve. The sky had turned iron gray by late afternoon clouds, packed heavy above the San Juans. A restless wind whipped through the grasses of the valley, flattening them in rolling waves, carrying with it the bite of cold and the smell of coming rain. Elias walked the dirt track that led to the Dalton Ranch, his boots striking hard against the packed earth. At his side and behind him came the horses, Storm in the lead, Arrow restless inside his stepping stone, steady but slow. Their hooves thudded a syncopated rhythm against the ground, a sound that carried far in the hollow stillness of the prairie. Every step tightened something inside Elias. Fury coiled low in his chest, tempered by the discipline that had carried him through years of service. He wanted to demand answers to see Claire's face when he told her what he'd found. But more than anger, there was a gnawing hunger for truth, for the words spoken from her own lips, however bitter they might be. The Dalton Ranch rose ahead, its roofline stark against the storm. Dark sky. Once it had been home, the house where he'd returned from patrols, the porch, where he'd watched sunsets with Claire, the barns, where Storm, Arrow, and Stone had first learned to carry his weight. Now it felt foreign, hostile, a battleground, waiting for the first shot. He stopped at the porch, tightened his grip on Storm's lead, and knocked. The sound echoed hollow through the boards, sharp as a gunshot in the stillness. A moment later, the door creaked open. Claire Dalton stood framed in the flighter doorway. Her auburn hair, once the color of fire in the evening sun, was tied back hastily, strands loose around a face, drawn thin by fatigue. The years had marked her, though her eyes were still the same, pale green. They widened now as they fell on Elias, then on the three mustangs standing behind him. Her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as if to shield herself from the sight. "Elias," she said, voice unsteady. When did you come back?" "2 nights ago." His voice was low, steady, but it carried the weight of iron. I found them. On your porch. Cold, hungry, beaten. Explain that to me, Claire. She flinched as though struck. Her gaze dropped to the boards, then flicked back up, evasive. It's not what you think, she murmured. Her hands rubbed her arms as though she could scrub the guilt from her skin. Before Elias could answer, another voice rolled from within the house, smooth and commanding. Who's at the door, Claire? The figure that emerged was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed with a care that wrire of self-regard. Mason Hale stepped into view, sleeves of his dark blue shirt rolled neatly to the forearms, a watch glinting gold on his wrist. His hair was slicked back his smile, a practiced curl that never touched his eyes. Well, Mason said, letting his gaze slide over Elias and then the horses. The war hero has returned, and he's brought along 3 wild beasts for company. Claire shifted uneasily between them, caught in the crossfire of presence alone. Elias's eyes stayed locked on Mason. They're not beasts, he said quietly. They're mine. The words hung sharp in the air, heavier than the wind that clawed at the eaves. Mason chuckled low and dismissive as he descended the porch steps. He folded his arms, posture casual but calculated. Mustangs, he said, rolling. The word like it left a bitter taste. They've been running the plains for centuries, braving blizzards and coyotes. They don't need your pampering. You think they're fragile. They're not. They're wild. They're stock. You cage them, ride them, sell them. That's their worth. He paused, his smirk deepening. You've grown soft, Warren. A real man. Knows a horse is a tool, not a partner. You of all people should understand that. Elias's breath came sharper, heavier. His hand tightened on Storm's lead until the rope cut into his palm. Behind him, Arrow skittered, drawing back, while Stone shifted nervously. But Storm stood his ground. His ears shot forward, head lowering as muscles coiled beneath his skin. Then the stallion stepped forward. The sound of his hoof striking the wood cracked across the yard like a gunshot, his neck-arched mane whipping in the wind, and from deep within his chest erupted a whinny, so fierce it split the storm-heavy air. It was no ordinary call. It was a challenge, a declaration. Storm planted himself squarely between Elias and Mason, every line of his body bristling with protective fury. His eyes, burned gold, locked on Mason with a hatred too pure to mistake. For the first time, Mason faltered. The smile slipped just for a heartbeat, replaced by something colder. He masked it quickly, but the moment had been seen. The yard fell silent, but for the howl of wind through the grass and Storm's sharp, ragged breathing. Elias laid a calming hand on the stallion's neck, feeling the taut muscle thrumming beneath the skin. His voice, when it came, was steady, measured. I've heard enough, he said, eyes never leaving Mason's. There's a place where this will be. Spoken, and it isn't here. He turned to Claire. For a long moment, he held her gaze, and she shifted beneath it, arms clutched tighter across her chest. His words landed like stones. I trusted you once, but now I trust only in justice. With that, he tugged gently on the lead, guiding Storm back. The stallion resisted for 2 paces, eyes still blazing toward Mason before retreating step by step, his body never turning, fully away. Arrow and Stone followed, nervous, glancing back with every stride. On the porch, Claire remained frozen, her lips parted, eyes clouded with something, between guilt and fear. Mason's face was hard now, the practiced smile gone, hands clenched into fists at his sides. Elias walked them down the dirt path when pressing hard at his back. He did not look over his shoulder. He didn't need to. Storm's gaze had already carved the truth into the earth behind them. The confrontation was over, but only for now. The days that followed the confrontation at Dalton Ranch fell into a rhythm. Elias rose before dawn, the cabin still, shrouded in mist, breath fogging the air as he pulled on his coat and boots. Outside, the ground glistened with dew, and the lake beyond lay pale and still, beneath the rising Sunday. The first sound he always heard was Storm's low whicker, a rumble of greeting that seemed half reminder, half reassurance. Arrow and Stone followed with soft snorts, ears swiveling, their shapes looming out of the gray. He led them each morning to the patch of ground behind the cabin, a clearing he'd scraped clean of rocks and debris circled by the rough fencing he directed on his first week back. There he spread hay, poured oats into buckets, and sprinkled mineral salt bought from a rancher near town. The horses ate hungrily, though Elias noted how each moved differently. Arrow always lunged first, muzzle buried in grain before he could set the bucket fully down, only to jerk his head up at the snap of a twig or cry of a crow. Stone, steady as ever, chewed slowly, pausing between mouthfuls as if to savor them. And Storm waited. Every morning the same, the stallion hung back, eyes watchful, letting the others eat first. Only when Arrow's hunger eased, and Stone's breathing slowed, did Storm step forward, lowering his head to the last of the feet. Elias stood by the fence arms, folded, and watched. It wasn't hesitation. It was discipline, a kind of order instilled years ago, and somehow carried, through neglect and hardship. After feeding came movement. Elias clipped leads to their halters and guided them through simple drill circles at a walk, gentle trots, lifts of each hoof to keep joints loose. Arrow twitched with impatience, sometimes breaking into a sudden burst of speed before Elias steadied him with a firm tug and a quiet word. Stone's strength returned more slowly, his legs stiff from disuse, but once set into motion, he carried through with the determination of a plow horse. Storm led them, both eyes always on Elias' ears, flicking at each command to the very picture of a leader holding his line. Elias brushed them down afterward, working the rough cloth through tangled manes, pressing fingers along ribs and shoulders to check for heat or swelling. Storm's bruise eased, turning from purple to yellow. Stone's neck wounds crusted and began to heal, though the scars would remain. Arrow's body bore fewer marks, but the tension in his eyes lingered, a wound of its own. Elias murmured constantly as he worked, voice low, steady, the way one speaks to old comrades around a fire. Slowly, he felt the tremors fade beneath his hands. Storm's behavior drew his notice most of all. The stallion carried himself like an officer among troops. When Arrow startled at a gust of wind, Storm shifted subtly, placing his shoulder between the gelling and the imagined threat. When Stone lagged, Storm circled back, touching muzzle to flank before resuming pace. He guarded them, not with aggression, but with presence. Calm, deliberate, undeniable. At feeding time, his patience was remarkable. Elias tested it once, offering him a bucket before the others. Storm flicked an ear, stepped aside, and let Arrow and Stone push forward. Only after they'd eaten their fill did he lower his head. His amber eyes lifted to Elias's as he chewed, steady and knowing, as if to say, "This is how it must be." Elias saw himself in that gaze, the same restraint, drilled into him in uniform, the same instinct to protect others before taking for himself. It struck him deeply, not as coincidence, but as continuity. The training he had instilled in Storm years ago remained carried like an ember through all the darkness that had followed. No cruelty had erased it. "You're still the captain," Elias murmured one morning, brushing the stallion's neck. Storm blew warm breath across his sleeve, and Elias smiled faintly despite himself. A week passed, and change showed in every stride. Arrow, once gaunt and skittish, began to run again. Not the frantic bursts of fear, but the eager gallop of remembered freedom. His ribs filled out, muscles rippling under his coat as he wheeled across the paddock. His whinnies grew louder, sharper, as if he were rediscovering his voice. Stone's breathing steadied. He no longer labored with each movement, but carried himself with a quiet power. Weight, shifting with controlled balance. The clouded look in his eyes cleared, replaced by a calm brightness Elias hadn't seen since before he left for deployment. He still bore the scars, deep ridges across his neck, but he wore them now. Like a soldier wears medals, marks of survival, not defeat. And Storm regained his shine. The black stallion's coat gleamed again in the morning sun, muscles filling in along his flanks. The rawhide knot, Elias had tied years ago, swung from his halter, worn smooth but intact, a constant reminder of their bond. When Elias tested old commands, Storm responded instantly, ears sharp, body moving with crisp obedience. Arrow hesitated, slower to recall, but followed Storm's lead. Stone held his ground with steadfast precision. The sound of their hooves on the packed earth, the chorus of their snorts and calls filled the cabin, clearing with life. Elias leaned on the fence one morning, listening, and felt the years peel back. It was the sound of training drills of mornings long ago when the world had seemed simpler. For a moment, he closed his eyes and heard not just horses but comrades, the steady beat of boots, the calls of men, working as one. That feeling deepened as the days turned. He began to see them, less as animals recovering and more as a unit reforming. Storm led unflinching. Arrow darted quick and agile, ready to cover gaps with speed. Stone anchored them, immovable when the line needed, and holding. Watching them together was like watching a formation fall back into place. It reminded Elias of patrols in foreign dust of brothers in arms who had shielded one another under fire, who had refused to leave anyone behind. He remembered the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, the way discipline and trust were the only things that kept chaos at bay. Now standing in the shadow of his cabin, he saw that same truth written in the language of horses. They were not pets, not possessions. They were his team, his family. One evening, as the sun bled orange over the lake, he leaned on the fence and spoke aloud, voice roughened with feeling. You're still the same, still my unit. All we need is time, and we'll be strong again. Storm lifted his head at the words, catching fire in the dying light. Arrow pressed close to his shoulder, ears flicking. Stone huffed and pawed at the ground as though seconding the vow. Elias felt something shift inside him, then a loosening of the solitude that had weighed on him since returning home. For the first time in years, he was not alone. He had his comrades again forged, not by blood, but by bond, not by his orders, but by choice. He rested his arms on the fence, watching them settle together, and let the warmth of belonging seep through the cracks of his hardened chest. By late afternoon, the warm sky had soured. Clouds gathered thick and black over the San Juans, rolling down into the valley, like a tide. The light faded fast, smothered by the dark mass overhead, until the cabin stood in a gray half-gloom. A wind rose threading through the pines around Animas Lake, whistling sharp enough to sting the ears. The water itself, usually calm and glass-like at dusk, shuddered into restless waves that caught what little light remained and shattered it into silver shards. Elias felt the change in his bones. He carried an armful of wood into the cabin, stacked it neatly, and stoked the fire until the flames flared against the iron walls of the stove. Heat filled the small room, but outside, the storm pressed harder. In the paddock, the horses stamped and shifted, unsettled by the electricity that ran like invisible current through the air. Storm tossed his head-made whipping, while Stone blew hard through his nose. Arrow was the most agitated of all sides, quivering eyes flashing white whenever. The wind rattled the tin roof. The first thunderclap rolled over the mountains long and hollow, and Arrow jerked it though struck. He sidestepped hard against the stall wall, breath pumping fast. Elias stepped out into the paddock rain, spitting against his shoulders, and lifted a hand to calm him. "It's just noise, boy," he said, voice steady, though even he felt the vibration rattle in his chest. The sky opened. Rain hammered the roof, the fence, the earth itself, drumming, like artillery. Lightning slashed white across the clouds, painting the world in stark relief. The storm had arrived in full, and with it came the breaking point. The next flash brought disaster. A bolt ripped the sky wide, so close the light seemed to explode inside Elias's skull. Arrow screamed, reared, and slammed against the stall door. The latch hadn't been set properly in Elias's haste. With a crash, it burst open, and Arrow bolted into the night. "Arrow!" Elias shouted, lunging forward. But the Gelling was already gone, a dark blur swallowed by the sheets of rain. Hooves pounded through mud and standing water, spraying arcs of silver under the lightning. Arrow tore toward the lakeman, plastered to his neck body, driven not by thought but pure panic. Storm erupted in a furious call, lunging against the fence as if he would follow. Stone kicked and snorted, pacing tight circles, his fear heavy as the storm itself. Elias grabbed his raincoat, yanked it over his shoulders, and snatched the hunting knife from the shelf by the peak door. He slammed the cabin door behind him and ran into the storm. Rain hit like thrown, gravel cold and punishing. He bent into it, boots slipping in the mud, following the thunder of hooves and the wild erratic flashes of movement near the lake. "Arrow!" he bellowed again, though the voice was drowned by the storm. He found him at the edge of the water. The Gelling had plunged down the sloped bank hooves, skidding in the mud until he slid into the shallows. His lead, rope, still tied from earlier exercises, had caught on a half-submerged root jutting from the bank. The rope twisted. Around it, pulled taut as Arrow struggled, locking him in place. The harder he fought that, the tighter it drew. Rain sheeted down his flanks. His sides heaved with effort, nostrils flaring. Wide eyes rolled until the whites gleamed stark in the lightning. Each surge of the lake slapped against his legs, tugging him sideways toward deeper water. Panic radiated from him in waves. Storm appeared on the rise above black, against the flashing sky. He reared high, shrieking a call that cut through the thunder voice raw with urgency. He pawed at the air hoof slicing, then came down, stamping the sound carrying across the storm as though urging Elias forward. Elias slid down the bank boots, plunging into sucking mud. The water surged cold around his calves, numbing instantly. He splashed forward, knife clutched in, one hand, the other reaching for the rope. Lightning lit the scene in fragments. Arrow straining, rope cutting deeper, water surging higher. "Hold still!" Elias shouted, though he knew the Gelling could not understand. Arrow jerked violently, nearly yanking him off balance. Elias slammed his knee into the mud, bracing himself, fingers scrabbling for the knot. The rope was swollen with water fibers slick beneath his grip. He sawed at it with a knife, each slice slow against the sodden strands. The Gelling shrieked, lunged sideways, and Elias was yanked nearly into the lake. Only by driving his other hand deep into the mud did he hold ground. He pressed closer, teeth gritted rain, blinding him. Above, Storm screamed again, a rallying cry that tore through the storm. Stone's deep bellow answered from the paddock, low and guttural. The sound poured strength into Elias's muscles as though the weight of the herd itself lent him force. With a final cut, the pond rope snapped. Elias dropped the knife, lunged for Arrow's halter, and wrapped both arms around the trembling neck. The Gelling crashed against him, powerful enough to crush ribs, but Elias held on. Together, they staggered backward out of the sucking water onto the churned mud of the bank. Arrow's legs buckled, and Elias went down with him, both sprawling in the muck as another wave crashed where they had stood only moments before. They lay there, gasping, thunder rolling overhead, rain pounding them flat. Elias pressed his forehead against Arrow's wet mane, breathing the sharp scent of horse and storm. "Easy," he rasped. "Easy, boy. You're safe." Arrow shuddered once, then went still, chest heaving. By the time they staggered back to the cabin, the worst of the storm had begun to pass. Rain still fell, but softer now, a steady sheet rather than the lashing torrent. Lightning flashed further off its growl, fading behind the ridge. Elias guided Arrow into the shelter, stripping the dripping rope away and rubbing him down with every dry cloth he could find. The Gelling trembled beneath his hands, not from cold alone, but from the echo of terror still coursing through him. Elias worked patiently, voice steady, checking legs for swelling, tracing fingers over fresh scrapes along the flank. Nothing broken, nothing torn. Storm pressed close muzzle, working over Arrow's damp coat, snorting warm reassurance into his side. Stone extended his head from his stall, blowing softly his rumble, a low comfort. Slowly, Arrow eased, his breathing steadied, his eyes lost the wild roll, lids drooping with exhaustion. Inside the cabin, the fire still burned, casting a steady glow against the wood. Elias settled into the doorway, watching, as the three horses clustered together. Storm stood tall flank, brushing Arrows, while Stone leaned close on the other side, their bodies pressed into a rough circle. The steam rose from their coats in the warmth, their breaths blending in rhythm. 3 steady pulses in the quiet. After the storm, Elias let the sight fill him, the tension draining from his shoulders. He understood it now clearer than ever. These were not simply horses, not animals bound by leather and chain. They were his unit, his formation, his comrades. He rested a hand on the doorframe and spoke softly, words barely above the crackle of the fire. "Not just horses," he said. "My team, my brothers, my family." The storm outside faded into silence. Within, the steady breathing of 3 mustangs and the warmth of their presence told him he was no longer alone. Durango stirred early. The town always had, though most mornings the streets were more whisper than bustle. A scattering of trucks idling outside, diners, the faint clatter of a delivery van rolling past storefronts. On this particular morning, with the storm washed clean from the sky and the mountains standing crisp against the horizon, Elias found himself walking along Main Street with purpose. He stopped outside a narrow brick building squeezed between a feed supply store and a shuttered antique shop. The wooden sign above the door had been painted a deep hunter green, the letters, in white, animal law and land rights. Marisol Vega-esque bearer. Elias stood a moment, raincoat folded under his arm, watching his breath cloud in the chill. He had faced firestorms and ambushes, but this door gave him pause. War had trained him for violence, not for paperwork, not for the language of courts. Still, the memory of Storm's furious cry and Arrow's near drowning in the lake hardened his step. He pushed the door open. The office smelled faintly of coffee and dust warmed by a small electric heater humming beneath a wide window. Files lay stacked in ordered piles across a scarred oak desk. On the walls hung framed photographs, horses galloping across plains, a child, and in braids, hugging a bay mare, a sepia print of a cavalry unit from another century. Behind the desk sat Marisol Vega. She was in her late 32s, dark hair pulled into a tight knot that revealed the stern lines of her fate. Her figure was lean, her posture upright, as though braced against constant winds. When she spoke, her voice carried a timbre of conviction, low, steady, unshaken. "Mr. Warren," she asked. Elias nodded. "That's right. Thank you for seeing me." "Bill Anders called ahead," she said, gesturing to the chair opposite her desk. "Said you might have something worth fighting for." He sat hands clasped and began to tell her, from the night he'd driven back into Durango, to finding Storm Arrow and Stone shivering on the Dalton porch, to the bruises, the scars, the storm that had nearly taken Arrow. He spoke evenly without embellishment, letting the facts stand. Marisol listened in silence, pen moving across a yellow pad, her gaze flicking between her notes and his face. She did not interrupt, though her brow tightened when he described Storm's injuries, and her lips pressed thin at the mention of chains in the clearing. When he finished, the pad was filled top to bottom with dense writing. She set the pen down, her eyes locked on his, dark and unyielding. "If even half of what you've told me is true," she said, "there's a case. And if all of it is, then Mason Hale has more to fear than losing 3 Mustangs." She began with records. For 2 days, she buried herself in the county courthouse, sifting deeds and licenses, while Elias worked at the garage with Bill and checked the horses each evening. When Marisol finally called, her voice crackled with restrained triumph. "I've traced property transactions tied to Dalton Ranch," she said, papers shuffling in the background. "Claire Dalton's name is on all of them, but the patterns are wrong. That's flipped in and out of her ownership in weeks, sometimes days, and always below market value. The proceeds move through accounts registered to LLCs that don't exist beyond a P.O. box in Nevada." Elias frowned. "You're saying Mason's using Claire as a front?" Marisol confirmed. "The paper trail shields him, but the intent is obvious. He's laundering money likely tied to livestock trade horses most of all. It fits with what you described. Mustangs penned, broken, sold off." She tapped something on her desk, voice sharpening. "If we prove this, Elias, it won't just return custody of your animals. It will indict Mason on fraud, cruelty, and trafficking. That's felony territory." Elias leaned back in the cab of his truck, phone pressed to his ear. Outside, Storm grazed with Arrow and Stone tails flicking in the autumn Sunday. He pictured Mason's smirk, the contempt in his voice when he called them beasts. The thought of turning that arrogance into chains of his own steadied Elias, like the weight of a rifle once had. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Witnesses," Marisol said, simply. "Someone who's seen the cruelty firsthand." They drove together that afternoon, Marie Soule in her dark sedan, Elias following in his truck with Storm's halter rope coiled on the seat beside him like a talisman. The road led them to the outskirts of town, where a weathered shack leaned against a windbreak of cottonwoods. Smoke curled from a rusted stovepipe. Hank Torres met them at the gate. He looked older than Elias remembered, though. Perhaps it was only the weight of regret that aged him. His frame was connated, wiry, his skin tanned and cracked from years outdoors. A cigarette dangled unlit between his fingers, shifting nervously from hand to hand, his hat brim shadowed eyes that had seen too much. Hank, Elias greeted. "It's been a while." "Too long, Hank," muttered, gaze sliding toward Marisol. "You brought a lawyer, then?" Marisol extended her hand. "Marisol Vega, I work animal law. I'd like to hear what you've seen." Hank's shoulders hunched. "Don't want trouble. You already had it," Elias said quietly. "You just walked away from it. Now I need you to speak." The silence stretched. Finally, Hank sighed, struck the cigarette against his palm, and began. He told them of Mason leading the Mustangs to the clearing of Storm, tied hard to a post, muscles straining until foam dripped from his mouth. He told them of the whip cracking of Mason's boot driving into Storm's ribs, when the stallion refused to bow. He described Arrow left thirsty circling, a bucket of green water, and Stone's neck rubbed raw by rope left too long. "Mason used to laugh," Hank said bitterly. "Keep them weak," he'd say. "Then they learn who's master." Elias's fists tightened at his sides. Hank looked away, voice dropping. I quit the day he kicked Storm. Couldn't stomach it. Should have spoken sooner. Maybe they'd have been spared more. Marisol leaned forward. Would you testify to this in court under oath? Hank hesitated, the cigarette trembling in his fingers. Then he drew a deep breath and nodded once. If it puts him where he belongs, I'll say it all. The drive back was quiet. Marisol trailed in her car, headlights sweeping the road, while Elias guided his truck toward the cabin. The horses rode in the trailer behind their presence, a steady anchor, even unseen. He pulled to a stop on the bluff above Animus Lake, killed the engine, and sat in silence. The wind tugged at the grass. In the rear, Storm shifted, and a moment later, his head poked through the trailer's small window pane, ruffled by the breeze. His eyes caught Elias in the mirror, steady and fierce, as though asking what came next. Elias reached back, laid his palm against the stallion's muzzle, and felt the warmth through the chill night air. We've got a chance now, he murmured. No one touches you again. Not him, not anyone. Storm blew softly, breath misting, and kept his gaze locked on Elias as the truck idled. Elias sat there for a long moment, staring out over the black shimmer of the lake. He realized then this fight had grown larger than his own return, larger than his 3 Mustangs. Mason's cruelty was only one thread in a net, cast wide over creatures who could not speak for themselves. If he won, it would be for all of them. The storm had nearly drowned Arrow, but this storm, the one building now, might just drown Mason Hale. The courthouse in Durango stood on a corner of Main Street, its red brick walls, weathered by more than a century of sun and snow. A flagpole rose from the front steps, the stars and stripes snapping sharply in the high country wind. On this morning, the sky was a pale winter blue, but the air carried the bite of frost. Townspeople drifted toward the building in small clusters, some with coffee cups clutched in their hands, others with scarves wrapped high against their cheeks. Inside, the wooden benches filled quickly. The scent of old varnish and paper hung in the air. Some had come out, flecks of curiosity drawn by the whisper of scandal. Others sat with arms folded, jaws set, their loyalties clear. The Dalton name had weight in this valley, but cruelty to animals struck deeper, and word of what Elias Warren had endured with his 3 Mustangs had traveled fast. Elias sat near the front beside Maras Vega. He wore a plain buttoned shirt, pressed as clean as he could make it, and his posture carried the stillness of a soldier waiting for orders. His eyes, however, showed the toll ringed with sleeplessness, shadowed with weeks of strain. His hand brushed now and then against his pocket, where the strip of rawhide Storm once carried, rested, coiled, and worn. Across the aisle sat Claire Dalton and Mason Hale. Claire's hair was swept into a neat knot, her cream jacket crisp, but her eyes were downcast as if afraid to meet the room. Mason, by contrast, leaned back with his arms crossed, jaw set in defiance. At his side, the attorney's slick-haired suit-pressed tie, knotted too tightly, flipped through a brief with the fake confidence of a man convinced of his own narrative. At the bench presided Judge Howard McCree, silver-haired and broad-shouldered, his gaze calm, his voice measured. McCree's reputation carried through the valley, a man not swayed by noise or lineage, but by law and fact. As he entered the gavel rapped once steady, and the room fell into silence. Mason's lawyer was the first to rise. His voice carried easily across the chamber, polished by years of practice. Your Honor, he began, this case is not about sentiment, however much Mr. Warren's side may wish it to be. It is about responsibility, about capacity. He spread his hands as if appealing to common sense. My clients, Miss Dalton and Mr. Hale, have maintained a working ranch. They have facilities, infrastructure, and means. Mr. Warren, though perhaps well-meaning, has none of these things. He lives in a rented cabin on the lakeside without proper stables, without long-term resources. He may care for these animals in the short term, but good intentions do not feed horses through winter. He paced a few steps, glancing toward the jury of townsfolk who sat stiff and attentive. We do not question Mr. Warren's affection, but affection alone is not stewardship. These Mustangs are not house pets. They are livestock requiring stability and financial commitment. My clients provide that. Mr. Warren, however, does not. As the words flowed, Mason's lips curled into a faint smirk. Claire kept her eyes down, fingers knotting together in her lap. The tide of opinions seemed to shift for a moment, and as murmurs ran through the benches, the picture painted was clear. Elias is a drifter, clinging to memories Mason and Claire as the responsible landowners. Elias's jaw tightened, but he did not rise. He sat steady, hands clasped, his silence deliberate. Marisol Vega stood, her voice cut clean through the murmur, steady as hammered steel. "Affection may not feed a horse, Your Honor," she said, "but neither does neglect. And today we bring not sentiment, but evidence." She turned toward the court. "I called Dr. Nora Fields." A woman in her early 40s stepped forward, her lab coat traded for a plain navy dress. Her hair was tied back and she carried herself with a quiet authority of long experience. Sworn in, she moved to the stand and Marisol approached with a file in hand. "Dr. Fields, can you tell the court about your examination of the 3 Mustangs, Storm Arrow and Stone? When Mr. Warren first brought them to you?" Nora opened the file, though her voice was confident without it. All 3 were underweight, significantly so. Their ribs were visible, muscle tone poor. Storm, the black stallion, carried fresh contusions along his flank, consistent with blunt trauma, possibly a kick or strike from a hard object. Arrow showed signs of prolonged stress, heightened startle responses, sweating under minimal exertion. Stone bore deep grooves around his neck, scar tissue indicating a rope or chain, left tight for extended periods. A ripple of unease passed through the benches. "Would you consider these conditions natural?" Marisol asked. "No," Nora replied firmly. "These were not the marks of wild living or poor pasture. They were inflicted prolonged, deliberate neglect and abuse." Mason shifted in his seat, jaw clenched. His lawyer cleared his throat, preparing a rebuttal, but Judge McCree gestured for Marisol to continue. "Your Honor," Marisol said, "the facts don't end there. I would now like to present visual evidence captured by a neighbor of Dalton Ranch." The clerk dimmed the lights and the projector whirred to life. On the wall above the judge, grainy footage appeared. The perspective was shaky, a phone camera peering through a fence slat. The image showed the Dalton yard, a post driven deep into the earth. Storm was tied to it, his black coat stray with sweat. He pulled against the rope muscles, straining hooves digging into the dirt. Then Mason appeared. He strode into frame, whip in hand, expression casual. He cracked the whip once against the ground, then raised it toward the stallion. Storm screamed, jerking back, and Mason moved and boot cocked, aiming for the stallion's side. The clip froze there, the stallion's eyes blazing, mouth open in a cry that echoed even in silence. Mason's foot poised mid-strike. The room went still. For a long moment, no one moved. Then whispers rippled through the benches. A woman near the back shook her head, lips pressed tight. A man muttered a curse. The sound of quiet outrage swelled until Judge McCree raised a hand. Mason's lawyer leapt to his feet. "Your Honor, this is prejudicial, unclear. There's no context." "No. Sit down," McCree said evenly. His voice carried no anger, only iron. "The evidence is clear enough," the lawyer faltered, sank back, sweat beating at his temples. Mason's jaw pulsed, his smirk gone, eyes narrowed at the frozen image of himself on the wall. When the lights returned, Marisol stepped forward again, her voice carrying the weight of the entire room. "This," she said, gesturing toward the screen, "is what my client found when he returned from service. 3 horses broken nearly past repair, a stallion battered for his pride, a gelding starved into terror, a draft horse scarred by a chains, and the man responsible stands here asking for custody as though nothing has happened." She turned her gaze sweeping across the benches, then fixed on Judge McCree. "Your Honor, this is not about property. It is about safety, about humanity, about whether the law will place living beings into the hands of a man proven to abuse them." Her voice softened, but the steel remained. Elias Warren may not own acres of land, he may not have wealth, but he has given these horses shelter, nourishment, and dignity. In a matter of weeks, they have gained weight, regained spirit, and returned to the condition a horse deserves. That is stewardship. That is capacity. She let the words sink in, then delivered the final blow. The law cannot hand back to the one who has repeatedly shown contempt for it. A small swell of applause broke from the Enantine benches, quickly hushed by the gavel, but the energy remained. The tide had shifted. Elias sat silent through it all, shoulders square, eyes lowered. His hand, he gripped the strip of rawhide Storm had once carried. Its edges were rough against his palm, grounding him. As the video replayed in his mind, he saw instead Storm standing, tall between him and Mason on the ranch porch man, snapping in the wind, hooves, striking the boards with defiance. He remembered the storm by the lake, Arrow's terror, and Storm's cry calling him to act. He remembered Stone leaning steady against Arrow in the cabin firelight. Every word Marisol spoke rang through him like a call he had heard years ago, across the desert firm, unyielding the desert, the voice of a leader holding the line. It was the same as Storm's voice as the Mustang's unity. For the first time in months, Elias felt belief stir within him. Not blind hope, but the hard certainty of a soldier recognizing momentum on his side. Justice at last was moving their way. The air inside the courthouse was so still that Elias could hear the faint creak of the bench beneath him as Judge Howard McCree adjusted his notes. Every eye in the chamber was fixed on the man at the bench. Mason Hale sat, rigid, jaw tight, Claire Dalton's gaze pinned to the floor. Marisol Vega folded her hands calmly. Before her, her expression betraying nothing. Elias felt the strip of rawhide in his pocket press against his palm, grounding him. Judge McCree's voice carried evenly, every word deliberate. This court finds that Mr. Elias Warren shall be restored full and rightful ownership of the Mustangs, Storm, Arrow, and Stone. A rustle moved through the gallery, but McCree raised a hand and continued. Furthermore, the Dalton property known as Dalton Ranch shall be returned to Mr. Warren as it stood prior to marital division. His eyes flicked briefly toward Claire. Miss Dalton is hereby prohibited from unsupervised contact with said animals until reviewed by this court. Claire's shoulders slumped, a shadow of regret flashing across her face. As for Mr. Hale, McCree went on, the court has reviewed substantial evidence of fraudulent transactions and possible trafficking. These matters are beyond my jurisdiction and will be referred to federal authorities for immediate investigation. The gavel struck wood with a sharp crack. The words hung in the air like the echo of thunder. Then came the whispers swelling into murmurs. Some nodded quietly in Elias's direction. Others shook their heads at Mason, whose face burned crimson with fury. Elias remained still, breathing slow, letting the weight of the moment sink in. It was finished. 2 days later, Elias steered his old Ford through the open gates of Dalton Ranch. The hinges groaned as if protesting their surrender, but the way stood clear. Beside him rode Jonah Pike, an old cavalry comrade who had driven down from Montreux when he'd heard the news. Jonah's laugh was rough as gravel, but his eyes were bright with pride. "Never thought I'd see you ride back through here as master again, Jonah," said, thumping the dash. "Neither did I." Elias admitted, his gaze sweeping the yard. The ranch looked weary. Fence posts leaned wood split by weather. The barn sagged, its roof patched in tin. The corral was half overrun with weeds. Yet, as Elias drove through, he felt a steady pulse beneath the ruin, as if the land itself recognized its steward had returned. They unloaded the Mustangs into the main corral. Storm snorted once, then tossed his head and bolted forward, hooves tearing up dust. Arrow shot after him, nimble and quick man flying. Stone thundered behind the redder ground, shaking beneath his stride. The three circled the pen, their voices rising in long, triumphant whinnies. Elias leaned against the fence and let the sight wash over him. A rare smile cracked his face. For years, this place had been a wound. Now, it was the beginning of healing. Work began at once. With Jonah's help, Elias stripped the rotted beams from the barn and set new planks. They repaired fences, driving posts deep, and stringing wire taut. The corral floor was leveled, spread with sand, so the Prophet Mustangs could run without strain. Hammer blows rang through the valley, mingling with the steady rhythm of hooves. By dusk, when the horses tore across the sand in a cloud of dust, Elias saw not ruin, but resurrection. And for the first time in years, he felt the ground beneath his boots answer like home. The ranch changed day by day. Smoke rose again from the chimney, curling into the crisp air. The kitchen windows glowed amber at night, spilling warmth across the porch. A lantern hung at the gate, swaying in the wind, a beacon to neighbors who now came more often, some with supplies, others just to see. They found a place reborn. The Mustangs, once gaunt and broken, stood sleek and proud. Storm's coat shone, black as riverstone. Arrow's chestnut gleamed. Stone's silver gray glowed in the dusk. Children from town pressed against the fence to watch them run, eyes wide with wonder. Old ranchers shook their heads, muttering disbelief at the stallion's power, the geling's agility, the draft, horses' resilience. Word spread until people began calling it the Freedom Ranch. To Elias, it was simply home, but he understood the name. It was more than his. It belonged to all who believed cruelty could be undone. Standing in the bare yard one evening, Elias watched as the mustangs wheeled information. The storm at the front arrow, flanking quick as firestone, steady as earth. The sound of their hooves rang out like drums carrying across the valley. He felt his chest swell, not with pride, but with belonging. He had not only reclaimed property, he had reclaimed trust his own. The town's the bond between man and horse. Winter crept down from the San Juans, laying its first veil across the valley. One night, the snow came in silence, drifting through the dark until it blanketed the fences in the training yard. The world glowed white beneath the moon. Inside the ranch house, fire crackled bright, filling the room with a golden warmth. Elias sat in a wooden chair by the hearth, hands resting on his knees, his body heavy with the honest fatigue of rebuilding. The shadows of the flames leapt across the cabin walls, weaving with the mournful sigh of the wind outside. Then a sound. Hoofbeats muffled on the packed snow, a slow creak on the porch boards. The half-open door nudged wider. Storm stepped inside. His breath rolled in clouds, nostrils flaring, eyes catching the firelight like molten glass. Between his teeth, he carried something small, a strip of rawhide, frayed and worn. Elias froze, his chest twisting. He knew it instantly. Years ago, before deployment, he had braided it himself, tying it to Storm's halter as a brother's token. Somehow, through absence and neglect, the stallion had kept it alive, carrying their bond across time. Storm moved closer. Each hoofall softened on the rug and pressed the rawhide into Elias's hand. Hazel met amber. For a heartbeat, nothing else in the world stirred. Arrow followed chestnut coat shimmering in the fire's glow, folding down near the hearth with a heavy sigh. Stone came last, massive and unshaken, lowering himself beside his companions until the three of them formed a circle around the flames, their breath rising in steady clouds. Elias's fingers tightened around the strip, still warm from Storm's mouth. Every chain, every courtroom, every betrayal seemed to burn away in that moment, leaving only this trust reforged, a bond unbroken. He leaned forward, whispering so low it was meant only for them. "We're back, and no one tears us apart again." The fire crackled in reply. The herd breathed as one, Storm's ears flicking, Arrow's warmth radiating, Stone's chest rumbling like distant thunder. Their shadows danced together, halos of gold across sinew and scar, man and Mustang bound not by law or blood, but by survival. Elias thought the war was finally over, that this was home reborn. But then, Storm's head snapped up, his ears pinned forward, muscles tightening. Arrow stirred. Stone rumbled uneasily. The silence broke. Outside, in the snow-laden dark, another set of hoofbeats echoed. Slower, heavier, different. Elias rose, the rawhide clenched in his fist, eyes fixed on the door as the flames flared high. Whatever waited beyond the threshold had followed them here, and the true battle was only beginning.